Welcome to the Facilitators Deep Dive Podcast, your podcast on your way to facilitation mastery.
Hey everybody, welcome to this deep dive with me today. We're going to be talking about lean change management and looking at some excerpts from the book Lean Change Management by Jason Little. I got to say this book is really refreshing. It's not your typical kind of like dry corporate approach to change management. There's one story in the book that really hooked me early on. It was about this Agile conference where Jason was participating in, a simulation that was based on the Virginia Satter change model. Have you ever heard of that?
Yeah, the Satter change model. It's fascinating, because it highlights all the emotions that people typically go through during times of change. You think about it, you might start with some resistance, right? And you're thrown into this chaos. You might even experience some depression, before you finally reach integration in a new status quo.
Yeah, that makes total sense. It's like no wonder change can be so tough sometimes, right? We're not just dealing with all the logistics that change, but we're also dealing with all of these emotions too.
Yeah, absolutely. And this story from the conference where someone was really motivated to move through this chaotic change simulation simply because the promise of talking to an Agile expert. It really highlights a key principle of lean change management. And that is, change is unpredictable, but you can influence it by understanding and tapping into what motivates people.
So it's not about forcing change on people. It's about really like understanding what drives them.
Yeah, that's a really different way of thinking about it. I'm already starting to see how this could be super useful in my own work. One thing that surprised me was how Jason connects these ideas to lean startup principles. Now, I usually think of lean startup in terms of developing new products.
Yeah.
Not necessarily, changing an entire organization.
Right. But that's the really clever thing about his approach. He argues that change initiatives are kind of like products themselves. We need to be testing our assumptions. We need to be gathering feedback, and we need to be able to adapt quickly, just like you would with any new product launch. Okay, I'm starting to see the connection there. So instead of creating this huge detailed plan up front, you're suggesting we take a more experimental approach.
Precisely. So imagine, you're trying to roll out a new software system across your company. Instead of, trying to train everybody on this new system all at once, you could, pilot the system with a small team first. Then, gather their feedback, learn from their experiences, and then you can refine the system before you do a wider rollout.
Okay, that's a much less intimidating way to think about it. So you're constantly learning and adjusting as you go, instead of betting everything on a single massive change. But what about those situations where you do have to plan things out in advance? Does Jason completely dismiss the idea of planning?
No, he doesn't dismiss planning altogether. But he does challenge the traditional plan-driven approach to change management. The kind where you spend, months creating this detailed plan. That ends up being way too rigid to adapt to the complexities of the real world.
Oh, yeah. I've definitely seen those plans backfire. They look amazing on paper, but then something unexpected happens, and the whole thing falls apart.
Exactly. The world's constantly changing, and organizations are these complex systems. So a feedback-driven approach, you're gathering insights, you're adapting your plan, and you're creating a more flexible process. It really allows you to be much more responsive to those inevitable surprises.
So it's less about sticking to the plan no matter what, and more about having a framework that can bend and flex as needed.
You got it. And Jason actually provides a really helpful framework for this. He calls it the lean change management cycle. And it's surprisingly simple. There's really just 3 stages: insights, options, and experiments.
Insights, options, experiments.
Okay.
I'm intrigued. Tell me more about how the cycle works.
It's all about continuous learning and adaptation. You start by gathering insights about the change you're trying to make. Then you generate multiple options for how you might address the challenge. And finally, you test those options through small-scale experiments.
Oh, wow. That sounds a lot more dynamic and engaging than just following a static plan. So you're constantly testing and refining your approach as you go. Now, I'm curious about how you actually gather those insights he's talking about. Does he have any specific tips for that?
He does. He's got a whole toolkit of practices and assessments. Some might be familiar to you, like retrospectives. But he also introduces some more unconventional methods like lean coffee sessions, and even something called culture hacking.
Culture hacking? What in the world is that?
It's a fascinating concept. He tells this story about how he intentionally disrupted a workspace move in order to expose a dysfunctional process and gather valuable feedback.
Wow, that's thinking outside the box. It makes you wonder, What other unexpected ways could you gather insights in your own workplace? Maybe you could set up a suggestion box or host a brainstorming session with people from different departments. Okay, so you've gathered your insights, you've brainstormed some options. What's next? How do you make sense of it all? And how do you start turning those options into action?
That's where, those change management frameworks that he mentions can come in handy. Things like Kotter's 8-step model or the McKinsey 7S framework. They can provide, a helpful structure for thinking through the different aspects of change.
I have to admit, when I hear framework, I sometimes get flashbacks to like those dense academic textbooks.
Yeah.
Are these frameworks really practical for everyday use?
That's the beauty of how Jason presents them. He sees them more as, tools to guide your thinking, not rigid recipes that you have to follow to the letter.
So it's more about taking what's useful from these frameworks and adapting it to your specific situation.
Exactly. For example, he suggests using Kotter's 8 steps as a checklist to make sure you've considered, all the important elements of change, but not necessarily following them in a strict linear order.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense. So you're not getting bogged down in the theory. You're focusing on what's actually going to work for you. I like that. Okay, so we've got insights, we've got options, we've got frameworks. What's the next step in this lean change management journey?
Well, once you've got, a good understanding of the situation and you've got some potential solutions, it's time to start generating some more specific options and then assessing their viability. And Jason really emphasizes, that you need to weigh certain factors like cost value and level of disruption when choosing an option. He uses, a great example from his own work where he had to decide whether to cancel this training program that wasn't really aligned with the company's Agile transformation.
Oh yeah, I remember that story. He was basically stuck between a rock and a hard place. Because canceling the training would upset a key stakeholder, but going ahead with it would mean investing time and money in something that wasn't really moving the needle.
It was a perfect illustration of, how these tough decisions come up all the time in change management. You have to be able to assess the potential impact of each option and then choose the one that makes the most sense for the situation.
And I loved how he introduced those visual tools,
Yeah.
the blast radius and the sphere of influence,
Yeah.
to help kind of think through those impacts.
They're so helpful, for visualizing those impacts. The blast radius helps you visualize the ripple effects of a change. Kind of like, those diagrams they show for asteroid impacts. You can see how far that impact will spread and who might be affected.
And the sphere of influence helps you identify those key players who can either champion the change or potentially become roadblocks. It's all about, understanding those power dynamics and figuring out how to navigate them effectively.
Absolutely. And once you've got a handle on those aspects, you can start turning those options into experiments. This is where the rubber really meets the road in lean change management.
Okay, so walk me through how this experimentation phase works. What does it actually look like in practice?
It's all about taking a hypothesis-driven approach. You start with a clear idea of what you want to achieve with the change, and then you design a small-scale experiment to test whether that idea actually works in practice.
So it's kind of like a scientific experiment, but applied to organizational change.
Precisely. And just like in science, it's really crucial to have a way to measure the results of your experiment. Jason highlights that it's not just about measuring behavior, but it's about understanding the overall outcomes and the impact on the people involved.
So going back to that software rollout example, you wouldn't just measure how many people logged into the new system. You'd also want to know if it actually made their work easier, if they felt more productive, and if it helped them achieve their goals.
Exactly. You want to look at the bigger picture and see if the change is actually moving the needle in the right direction.
Now, speaking of moving the needle, one of the things I always struggle with is choosing the right metrics to track. I feel like it's so easy to get lost in a sea of data, but how do you know what's truly important?
Jason is very clear that focusing solely on behavior metrics can be misleading. Just because people are using a new tool or attending a training, it doesn't necessarily mean that the change is successful. He emphasizes the importance of what he calls outcome metrics.
Right. So instead of tracking, how many people showed up for a training session on the new software, you'd want to measure things like whether the training actually improved their skills, whether they're using those skills on the job,
Right.
and whether it's ultimately leading to, better outcomes for the team or the organization.
You got it. He uses that great anecdote about the resort. That achieved a significant increase in customer satisfaction, simply by letting each department define their own leading and lagging indicators. They focused on the outcomes that mattered most to their customers and then empowered their teams to figure out how to achieve them.
That's a powerful example of how Aligning your metrics with your desired outcomes can really make a huge difference. But with all this talk about experimentation and gathering feedback, it sounds like things could get pretty chaotic pretty quickly. How do you keep everybody on the same page and make sure that the change is moving in the right direction?
That's where, Jason's emphasis on alignment comes in. He dedicates a whole chapter to the importance of creating alignment throughout the change process.
And it's not just about having, a clear vision, right? It's also about making sure that everyone understands that vision and feels like they're part of the journey.
Absolutely. And that's where tools like canvases and one-page plans can be incredibly helpful.
Oh, yes, he's a big fan of those. And I have to say, I'm a sucker for any tool that helps me visualize complex information and make it easier to understand. But are these canvases really enough to keep a large-scale change initiative on track?
Well, Jason doesn't see them as the be-all and end-all solution, but he argues that they're a great way to create a shared understanding of the change, to track progress, and to make adjustments as needed without getting bogged down in, excessive documentation.
I can definitely see the appeal of that. Who hasn't been frustrated by, those endless PowerPoint presentations and spreadsheets that seem to accompany every change initiative?
He emphasizes that the key is to use these tools in a way that's collaborative and transparent. So, for example, he suggests creating a dedicated change program room where you can visualize your plan, track your experiments, and have those crucial conversations with your change team and other stakeholders.
It's like creating a command center for the change initiative, where everyone can see what's happening, provide input, and stay connected to the process.
Exactly. It brings that visibility and transparency that can be so crucial, especially in larger organizations. And to maintain that alignment, Jason also suggests having regular change team stand-up meetings and retrospectives.
So just like you would on an Agile software development project.
It's the same principle. These short, focused meetings help you stay aligned, identify and address any roadblocks, and continuously improve your change process.
That makes sense. It's about creating those regular touch points where you can check in, share updates, and make sure everyone is still rowing in the same direction.
And speaking of rowing in the same direction, one thing Jason really emphasizes is the importance of building a strong change agent network throughout the organization.
Oh, I'm so glad you brought that up. Because I was just thinking, with all this talk about experimentation and feedback, it's clear that you can't just drive change from the top down. You need people at all levels of the organization to be on board and actively involved.
You hit the nail on the head. Jason advocates for finding those passionate individuals across different departments and levels who are really excited about the change, and then give them the support and resources they need to be successful. They become your champions, your evangelists, your agents of change within the organization.
I love that idea of a grassroots movement for change. It's not just about top-down mandates. It's about empowering people at all levels to be part of the solution.
And ultimately, that's what led to some pretty impressive results at the Commission. They saw improvements in productivity, quality, and morale, which is pretty much the holy grail of organizational change.
So after going through all these real-world experiences, what would you say are Jason's biggest takeaways? What are the key lessons he wants readers to walk away with?
I think the overarching message is that lean change management is not a one-size-fits-all solution. It's a mindset shift, a commitment to continuous learning and adaptation, and a recognition that change is ultimately about people.
It's not about finding the perfect framework or following a set of prescribed steps. It's about understanding your unique context, experimenting and iterating until you find what works for your organization.
He emphasizes that change is going to be messy. You're going to make mistakes, but that's okay. It's all part of the process.
That's such an important point. We often try to avoid failure at all costs, but in reality, those failures can be our greatest teachers.
He also stresses the importance of empathy, communication, and co-creation. You can't just dictate change from the top down. You need to involve people, listen to their concerns, and give them a voice in shaping the future.
So as we wrap up part 2 of our deep dive into lean change management, I'm curious, what's resonating with you the most? What are you taking away from this exploration?
What stands out to me is how lean change management encourages us to embrace the uncertainty and complexity of change. It's not about trying to control every aspect of the process, but about creating a framework that's flexible enough to adapt to the inevitable twists and turns.
I completely agree. It's about letting go of that illusion of control and embracing a more experimental, iterative approach. And as we've seen from Jason's own experiences, it's not always easy, but it can lead to some truly remarkable results. Welcome back to our deep dive, everybody. You know what I really appreciate about Jason's book? Is that he doesn't shy away from sharing, his own missteps. It makes this whole lean change management approach feel a lot more real more human, you know?
Yeah, it does. Like that story where he talks about trying to completely flip the script on status reporting. He thought that starting every project in the red status would
Yeah.
kind of help focus attention where it was needed. But it ended up just causing a ton of confusion and pushback.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that even when we have the best intentions, change can be messy and unpredictable, right? And it kind of highlights something we were talking about earlier, that importance of really getting buy-in and understanding the existing culture
Sure.
before you launch into, a big change.
Absolutely. And he also talks about facing some challenges. Implementing lean change management at Commission, this big bureaucratic organization that he calls the Commission.
Yeah.
Imagine trying to introduce, concepts like Kanban and visual management in a place that's used to doing things a certain way for decades.
Oh, yeah, that sounds like an uphill battle.
Yeah.
Did he have any wins at the commission? Or was it just constant resistance?
He had both, actually.
Yeah.
He talks about how trying to implement a company-wide Kanban board was maybe a little too much too soon. It's a great example of how we can get so excited about a tool or framework that we forget to really consider, if it's the right fit for the people and the context.
Oh, we've all been there, right? You find that shiny new tool and you're like, this is going to solve all our problems.
Yeah.
But then you try to implement it, and it just doesn't quite work the way you expected.
Yeah, he definitely learned some hard lessons about, the importance of starting small, experimenting and adapting along the way. But despite those challenges, he was able to make some real progress, introducing things like lean coffee sessions, created a space for open dialogue, and information radiators helped make work visible, which was a big shift for the Commission.
It's interesting how those seemingly small changes can sometimes have a ripple effect and lead to a bigger cultural shift. It reminds me of what we were talking about before, about those change agents. Did he talk about how he cultivated those at the Commission?
He did. He talks about how they created this network of change agents throughout the organization, people who were passionate about making things better and who could really help champion those new ways of working.
I love that idea of like a grassroots movement for change. It's not just about top-down mandates. It's about empowering people at all levels to be part of the solution.
And ultimately, that's what led to some pretty impressive results at the Commission. They saw improvements in productivity, quality, and morale, which is, pretty much the holy grail of organizational change.
So after going through all of these real-world experiences, what would you say are Jason's biggest takeaways from all this? What are the key lessons that he really wants readers to walk away with?
I think the overarching message is that lean change management is not a one-size-fits-all solution. It's really more of a mindset shift, a commitment to continuous learning and adaptation, and a recognition that change is ultimately about people.
Yeah, it's not about, finding the perfect framework or following a set of prescribed steps. It's about understanding your unique context, experimenting, iterating until you find what works for your organization.
And he emphasizes that change is going to be messy. You're going to make mistakes along the way. But that's okay. It's all part of the process.
That's such an important point. We often try to avoid failure at all costs. But in reality, those failures can be our greatest teachers.
Yeah, and he also stresses the importance of empathy communication and co-creation. You can't just dictate change from the top down. You need to involve people, listen to their concerns, and really give them a voice in shaping the future.
Well, I think that's a great place to wrap up our deep dive. Thanks for joining us, everybody. We hope you learned a thing or two about lean change management. Until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and keep changing.
See you next time on the Facilitators Deep Dive Podcast, your podcast on your way to facilitation mastery. Until next time.
See you then.